So I've entitled my sermon this week, Unity in Error. Of course, we know the scriptures call for unity, and God wants his people to be united, but we need to be united by being grounded on truth. We also know the scriptures teach that in these last days, there's going to be a counterfeit movement for unity. And I believe that very counterfeit movement is happening right now all around us. And I'd like to demonstrate tonight how that is, and also in the context of our prophetic studies that we've had, including our study last week, where we reviewed how prophecy is fulfilling in these last days, just as we have been expecting and even been predicting through our studies of the 7 times prophecy and its repetition according to the biblical principle of interpretation, the day-year-day principle of prophetic interpretation that we've examined. So I want to begin with the idea and to see this unity from the scriptures and then see how it's happening in the world and fulfilling. So it tells us right here in Revelation chapter 13 about the beast that rose up out of the sea, the conglomerate beast from the beasts of Daniel chapter 7 all together, which we understand to be the papal power, the system of the papacy that rose up in history. And we're told in verse 3, "And I saw one of his heads as it were wounded to death, and his deadly wound was healed, and all the world wondered after the beast." So there we see the principle of unity, of false unity, where all the world comes together and is wondering after the beast. And then also in Revelation chapter 18, when another angel comes down from heaven, having great power, and the earth is lightened with his glory, which we spoke about a little bit last week, how God's special message of the third angel's message of righteousness by faith is going forth with latter rain power right now, and that this crisis that we're in right now is a reaction to that message of proclaiming liberty throughout all the land unto all the inhabitants thereof, freedom in Christ from sin. And we see the reaction here in verses 2 and 3. "And he cried mightily with a strong voice, saying, Babylon the great is fallen, has become a help of the very foul spirit, and the cage of every unclean and hateful bird. For all nations have drunk of the wine of the wrath of her fornication, and the kings of the earth have committed fornication with her, and the merchants of the earth are waxed rich through the abundance of her delicacies." So again, we see all nations. This is a counterfeit unity. They're drunk on the false teachings, the false doctrines of false religion. And we see both the kings of the earth, that's the political power of the earth, that's the big businesses of the earth, are all coming together. So we have a false unity of false religion, of political power, of all nations on the earth, and of the merchants of the earth who are getting rich as a consequence of the false system. And then the cry goes forth, "And I heard another voice from heaven saying, Come out of her, my people, that ye be not partakers of her sins, and that ye receive not of her plagues, for her sins have reached unto heaven, and God hath remembered her iniquities." So God's people are obviously caught up in this system, and they need to be called out. They're caught up in Babylon. And this is even where I got the name for my YouTube channel, Another Voice from Heaven, because of the light that the Lord gave me several years ago showed me that this is the point that we've reached prophetically in history. And I'd like to be able to now demonstrate that in our sermon this evening. So in our previous studies, we've seen on our prophetic chart here the repetition of the prophetic periods as we talked about last week, we need to prophesy again, and that was repeating the messages, the prophetic messages given on the prophetic charts preached by the early Advent believers, as we see here on the screen. And that those prophetic periods, which had a fulfillment historically according to the year-day principle, with all of them concluding by the year 1844, have to be prophesied again. But now these same prophetic periods are repeating in antitype in literal days in our day. And we've been demonstrating this principle through our prophetic studies. And we saw in previous studies that it all began with the Pope's visit in September 2015, which was September 23rd to September 27th, 2015. And it was from the Day of Atonement to the Feast of Tabernacles that year. And then we saw that according to that principle, there was an anti-typical 508 happened in February 2019, especially connected with President Trump's State of the Union speech that year on February 5th, 2019, which was exactly 1,230 days from the date, September 24th, when the Pope gave his speech to the U.S. Congress for the political leadership of this country to follow the Catholic social teaching of the common good. And then exactly 1,230 days later, President Trump, in his State of the Union speech on February 5th, 2019, also called for the political leadership of the United States to follow the principle of the common good. We also saw back on the Pope's visit on September 25th, 2015, the very next day after the speech to Congress, the Pope spoke to the United Nations and called for them to implement the Sustainable Development Goals, which included a program for a world leadership, a one world government, as it were, and that included principles to protect the environment that necessitated the need to honor Sunday as a holy day, just as the common good also had that same principle at its heart. And that exactly 1,260 days later, to the day, on March 8th, 2019, all of the world religions met at the Vatican to discuss those Sustainable Development Goals and came to the conclusion that the religions needed to unite in telling the governments how to implement those principles and to give moral authority to see that they were implemented. And we made the contention that those events involved the fulfillment of the types, the patterns developed in history in AD 508 and AD 538. And that thus we would expect that a time of a union of church and state should follow for 1,260 days. And that we also would be expecting the outpouring of the Holy Spirit in the latter rain to empower the third angel's message. So, though there were some questions following our talk last week, and to clear those up and to really see how this is truly actually happening now is the purpose of our sermon this evening. So, let's see how we can understand this. In our previous studies, to see the principles that are repeating an antitype, we had to look at some certain Catholic social teachings that are at the heart of understanding them. So here's a website that we've looked at in our previous prophetic studies, but to remind us, it's an official Catholic website, catholicsocialteaching.org, and it's based in the UK. And here is a website that's a glossary of terms from Catholic social. This one we're going to look at is the term the common good. We need to understand what it means when the Pope calls for the common good, and now when they're calling for the common good to be followed. And we see some really interesting principles here. It tells us here in this official Catholic website, the common good is the complete development of all the people of the world. We see it's a universal message that applies to every single human being alive on the planet. John the 23rd describes it as the sum total of the conditions of social living, whereby persons are enabled more fully and readily to achieve their own perfection. This is a principle of righteousness by works. This is not striving to attain to the perfection of Jesus Christ, the measure of the stature of the fullness of Christ, by surrendering all and allowing the Holy Spirit to fill you, to live the life that Christ lived, that he might glorify his name in you. No, this is a principle of achieving your own perfection by your own works. And we see, according to this principle, the conditions of social living, which includes all aspects of society, economic, financial, social, political, religious, all of those resources being given to the people to achieve their own perfection. It continues, the idea therefore differs from that of pursuing the greatest good for the greatest number, with which it is sometimes confused, because the pursuit of the common good entrusts both to the government and to the church care for the greatest good of all persons, not just the greatest possible number. So we see the common good has the principle of the government and the church working together. The union of church and state is at the heart of implementing the common good. And it's for all persons. It's not just for some persons. It's for everybody, has to be subject to the common good and to be under this union of church and state. It continues, no individual is excluded from the common good. You cannot opt out of the principle of the common good that they're seeking to implement. There is no opting out. You either go along, you either take the mark, or you need to be done away with. It is also therefore linked to the ideas of human dignity and authentic and integral human development, making them central aims of all societies. So we're going to have to look very closely, especially at this authentic and integral human development, because we saw that that was a key principle of implementing the common good. We're going to have those definitions right here. It continues, the Bishops' Conference of England and Wales described the notion in terms of interdependency. Because we are interdependent, the common good is more like a multiplication sum, where if any one number is zero, then the total is always zero. If anyone is left out and deprived of what is essential, then the common good has been betrayed. So if you seek to try to opt out of this church-state union, controlling all levers of power in society, then you're a zero that's bringing everybody else down to zero. And you're actually betraying everybody else. You are going to be a pariah, and you are going to be excluded, and you're actually going to be ultimately done away with. Almost like a virus that needs to be gotten rid of. The common good also provides a balance against too strong an individualism by emphasizing the social aspect of the human person. Authentic development is possible only if an individual interacts with and grows within a society. Thus, each of us is required to work for the common good, which includes all others within society. Even property of its nature also has a social aspect, which is based on the law of the common purpose of goods. So we see that individualism has to be done away with, while the needs of the greater good, the common good for all people, which involves a union of church and state, has to be given the supremacy. And everybody, each of us is required to work for this common good. You cannot opt out. And we see also all property, all the goods of all society are subject to being redistributed according to the principles of the common good. Now, if we go to this idea of authentic human development, let's look at that quickly. It mentions as a key principle as part of the common good. Authentic development involves a search for a humanism which will enable everyone to find themselves anew by embracing the higher values of love and friendship, of prayer and contemplation. Authentic development is for each and all the transition from less human conditions to those which are more human. You see, it's a man-centered mindset. It's not a God-centered mindset. It's a man-centered mindset, this authentic human development. It's, again, for everybody. It's humanism. Very human-focused, not God-focused. And it has good-sounding principles like love and friendship and prayer and contemplation, but excluding God, these are not true biblical principles. The nature of authentic development is such that all the nations of the world must participate, for example, through fair trade relationships and international cooperation, or it will not be true development. Quoting John Paul II. So we see here again, all the nations of the world must participate. We saw in both Revelation 13 and Revelation 18 that all nations commit fornication with the beast. Continuing on, we also have integral human development, which is this idea in the context of Catholic social teaching stresses that development, something that economics and politics also aims at, is not simply development of social, political, or economic units, but is the development of persons. As a result, integral human development requires the development of all the aspects of the person, including the spiritual. It is often also spoken of as true or authentic human development. To be authentic, it must be well-rounded. It must foster the development of each man and the whole man. So we see here again, it's combining religion and politics and economics. Just like we saw in Revelation 18, we had false religion and all the nations of the earth, all the kings of the earth, and also the merchants of the earth. All that idea is in integral human development, fulfilling the prophecy of Revelation 18:3. This approach to development rejects the idea that development aims merely at fulfilling of basic needs, such as food and shelter. It argues on the basis of human solidarity, very interesting, another principle we're going to have to understand, that all people should be involved in the integral and authentic development of all. Again, you cannot opt out. Development in this sense gives attention to economic justice, ecological sustainability, the environment, very interesting, and other values that go beyond speaking of development only in terms of economic growth. The idea was the heart of this advanced by Paul VI and also by Benedict. So let's look at this idea of solidarity next, because we're going to see these are key terms that we're going to see come up as we continue tonight. Solidarity is one of the key principles of Catholic social teaching. It's not a side principle, it's a key principle, just like the common good and integral human development. It arises from a particular way of looking at the interconnectedness of people living in different parts of the world that is a feature of our contemporary human existence. In order to be at the service of the human person, these relationships of interdependence between individuals and peoples, which are de facto forms of solidarity, have to be transformed into relationships tending towards genuine, ethical, social solidarity. This means that solidarity in its fullest sense is both a social principle and a moral virtue, combining church and state. That's at the heart, and that everybody's together in doing it. We're all in it together. Solidarity. This establishes a clear distinction for action on behalf of solidarity which is not a feeling of vague compassion or shallow distress at the misfortunes of so many people, both near and afar. On the contrary, it is a firm and persevering determination to commit oneself to the common good. So solidarity, everybody's in it together, has the idea that we're all in it together and we have to be committed firmly to implementing the common good, which is committing all the resources of society, combining church and state for the principle of righteousness by works, which is in rebellion against God. We're going to see also Sunday sacredness. That is to say, to the good in all, to the good of all and of each individual. Everybody can't opt out because we are all really responsible for all. The social concern of the church, this results in a real desire to build up the unity of the human family. We see the principle of false unity at the heart of these Catholic social teachings, striving for the integral development of all men and women who are now interconnected by relationships of mutual concern and support. Solidarity is first and foremost a sense of responsibility on the part of everyone with regard to everyone. No one opts out. And the last important principle that we need to understand is the word subsidiarity. Subsidiarity is one of the key principles of Catholic social teaching. So just like the common good and integral human development and solidarity, subsidiarity is a key principle of Catholic social teaching. Its basic principle is that matters should be dealt with at the lowest or most appropriate authority, and that a central authority should perform only those tasks that cannot be carried out at a more local level. Have you noticed that happening in this crisis? The emergencies are implemented and enforced at the local level, at the community or city level, and then with also a local oversight level by the state emergencies that have been implemented. And then there is only a higher authority at the federal level that is ensuring that all of the principles, the lower emergencies, are moving towards the principle of implementing the common good. So this principle of subsidiarity is being implemented right now in this crisis, of this corona crisis. The higher authority should ensure that the freedom and initiative of local groups and should enable these groups to fulfill their duties toward the community, the common good. Local principle participation is essential to subsidiarity. It places responsibility on the individual to work towards the common good. We see here the lower authority and overseen by the higher authority. The whole principle is to implement the common good. Between the individual and the state, there are many intermediate communities, of which the family is clearest example, which can and should develop as real communities of persons and strengthen the social fabric, preventing society from becoming an anonymous and impersonal mass, as unfortunately often happens today. The individual today is often suffocated between two poles represented by the state and the marketplace. At times, it seems as though he or she exists only as a producer and consumer of goods or as an object of state administration. People lose sight of the fact that life in society has neither a market nor the state as its final purpose, since life itself has a unique value which the state and the market must serve. The state and the market, politics and economy must serve the higher purpose of the religious purpose as defined by the Catholic Church, the common good. These intermediate communities play a crucial role in the life not only of society but of the church also, union of church and state. Through them, people can participate in the building up of these larger realities in ways that are appropriate to their circumstances and life. And that's enough for now. So we see here, we have these key principles: the common good, authentic and integral human development, solidarity, and subsidiarity. Now we see, this is in some ways all a review of what we've seen before, but we're going to bring it all home to current events. So here in the Catechism of the Catholic Church, on what they call the third commandment, which is really the fourth commandment, on the Sabbath day, just to make clear for us, it tells us this principle. Here it says, in respecting religious liberty and the common good of all, Christians should seek the recognition of Sundays and the church holy days as legal holidays. So we see here, right from the Catechism of the Catholic Church, this is coming right from the Vatican website, it clearly tells us that a principle of the common good is that Sunday has to be legislated as a legal holiday. Legislating Sunday sacredness as part of this common good that has to be implemented, that no one can opt out, that has to be implemented first at the lowest level, the community level, and overseen by a higher authority, and that we're all in it together and nobody can opt out. And it's about following the principle of righteousness by faith, righteousness by works in a man-centered religion. So just to remind ourselves, again, on Thursday, September 24th, 2015, Pope Francis had addressed a joint session of the United States Congress. And in this, we see right here that he calls for the common good. He told the U.S. Congress that the chief aim of all politics is the common good. He also told them that building a future of freedom requires love of the common good and cooperation in a spirit of subsidiarity and solidarity. See how he's throwing these words into a speech where many people don't really understand what he's saying. But we've just read the definitions to understand what he's really saying. He's calling for a union of church and state to implement legislating Sunday sacredness, where no one can opt out, and it has to be implemented first at the local level and overseen at higher national and ultimately a world level by the Pope himself. And you have to love the common good. You don't have to love God, you have to love the common good. So that's what the Pope called for when he spoke to Congress. And then we see here at the President Trump's State of the Union speech, exactly 1,230 days later, which according to the biblical day-your-day principle would mark AD 508 in antitype, where the civil power yielded to the Bishop of Rome in AD 508. Here, President Trump's State of the Union speech, he gives a speech, and what does he call for here? But President Trump called for cooperating and compromise for the common good and healing old wounds at the same time by cooperating and compromising for the common good, working together, integral human development and solidarity for the common good, legislating Sunday sacredness and subjecting all the resources of society to enable people to achieve their own perfection by righteousness by works in rebellion against God. The exact thing that we would have expected to happen at the antitypical 85 event happened last year in that State of the Union speech. And then we also saw in his speech to the United Nations here, he called for sustainable development to be implemented by all the countries of the world, working together, all the nations of the world, the world government, as it were, the United Nations, to implement sustainable development, specifically the Sustainable Development Goals, which we looked at, which the Sustainable Development Goals included many principles in rebellion against God, including the idea of educating the whole world to follow these principles, and also protecting the environment, which will also require legislating Sunday sacredness. So he twice called, and he specifically references the adoption of the 2030 Agenda for Sustainable Development at the World Summit at the United Nations, which opens today, is an important sign of hope. So he told them to implement the 2030 Agenda for Sustainable Development, which is what we refer to as the Sustainable Development Goals, in the speech. And then he concluded his speech, by the way, by calling for them to follow and serve the common good, that all the nations of the world, all the kings of the earth, have to strive sincerely to serve the common good, which is implementing Catholic social teaching, including legislating Sunday sacredness. Then we see here on this website that, speaking of these official UN Sustainable Development Goals for the 2030 Agenda, there were 17 of them. We looked at them all in detail in a previous study, but we confirm here, which we saw, that it tells us that these were universally adopted by the nations of the world at the United Nations plenary meeting in New York on September 25th, 2015, right after the Pope gave his speech, telling all of the world leaders in an unprecedented speech to the world leaders of the nations by a Pope that they had to adopt the Sustainable Development Goals to implement the common good. Every single nation in the world universally adopted them. The civil power acknowledging the Bishop of Rome and pointing to that they are willing to do so by implementing, by voting to approve and adopt the Sustainable Development Goals. And of course, they include the environment. Right there, number 13 is climate action. And here in the Pope's encyclical letter, also from 2015, we see here that in this encyclical Laudato Si, calls for legislating Sunday sacredness and honoring Sunday as the Sabbath of the Lord, like the Jewish Sabbath, and centered on the Eucharist, the golden cup with abominations in it. And so a law of weekly rest is necessary in order to implement Sunday. So this is a principle for the environment, giving a break for the environment by ceasing all economic and business activity once a week, one day a week, on Sunday. So we see that the principle of legislating Sunday sacredness is both in the common good and in the Sustainable Development Goals. And then, of course, we see here on March 8th, 2019, exactly 1,260 days after the speech to the United Nations, when all the nations of the earth said that they would follow the Sustainable Development Goals and voted unanimously to adopt them, exactly 1,260 days later, which would be an antitypical 538, when historically the religious power yielded to the Bishop of Rome, all the religions of the world met at the Vatican in a conference, an international conference called Religions and the Sustainable Development Goals. And we saw in our previous study that all the religions of the world, sadly, including our church, the Seventh-day Adventist Church representatives were there, all of them agreed to the principle that the Sustainable Development Goals had to be implemented, and that they weren't being implemented universally and speedily enough by the nations of the earth, and that the religions of the earth, the religious power, had to tell the civil power what to do, and that they had to implement them and they had to give their moral authority over the civil power to ensure that the Sustainable Development Goals were actually implemented by 2030, Agenda 2030. Then we saw also that the education program at the United Nations included the work of the Lucis Trust in promoting goodwill is love in action. This is not the love of God. This is a counterfeit love from the enemy, because the Lucis Trust was originally officially called the Lucifer Publishing Company. And the Lucis Trust is entirely based on the writings of the channeled writings of Alice A. Bailey, where she channeled writings from a demon and said that Lucifer was the logos, Lucifer was the light of the world, and that everybody had to follow him. And that the entire education program of the entire world for over 20 years now, the World Core Curriculum, as implemented in America as the Common Core Curriculum, is based on the teachings of the Lucis Trust and this principle of goodwill, which is also the principle we saw of the Catholic social teaching of integral human development or human fraternity. Everybody working together in goodwill to bring about the common good. And we see right here from the Lucis Trust the connection of the Lucis Trust, its official connection to the UN and also to the Sustainable Development Goals for humanity, a human-centered religion. And I won't go into all the plans, but we see there that there has been a plan to implement it. And also it tells us this plan has always existed and is part of the greater design of the cosmos. Specifically, it's Lucifer's design to set up his kingdom on this earth. And then, of course, here we see that a UN official has called for all world religions to defer to the authority of the United Nations, especially in certain things, including in a guarantee to everyone, again, no one can opt out, special things for women and girls, which we saw in our previous study actually meant ensuring that there is open access to abortion, murdering babies anywhere and everywhere be a legal right, for LGBT rights in direct contravention to God's plan for the family and for the proper relationship between a man and a woman, and also to an equal right for freedom of religion or belief, which they're actually defining as saying that all religions are equal and no religion can claim to actually, quote, have the truth that excludes any other religion. And then also we saw how during the day before Trump gave his State of the Union speech last year, the Pope signed a document on human fraternity for world peace and living together with a Grand Imam in the United Arab Emirates, where the principle of integral and authentic human development was the heart of this document, where all the religions need to cooperate together to implement the common good. And everybody's in together in solidarity and no one can opt out. And the religions are coming together to make it happen. And then, of course, we also saw previously that just a couple months later, in May of 2019, the Pope announced that the common good has become global. That not only has America signed on to it and all the religions of the world, but all of the entire world globally is now on board for implementing the common good. Let's see how they're now actually doing this. And by the way, it's the Agenda 2030. The agenda says it has to be all in place by the year 2030. But here we see an article from the head of the UN, which warns that climate change supposedly has gotten so bad and has run away that it has to be implemented within 2 years. And this was from the fall of 2018. So he tells us here, if we do not change course by when? By 2020, we risk missing the point where we can avoid runaway climate change. So now they're saying that the Sustainable Development Goals, including related to climate change, can't wait to 2030. They now have to start being implemented by 2020. What time is it now that we're actually talking about this? 2020. Is this corona crisis have something to do with implementing the Sustainable Development Goals and the common good and legislating Sunday sacredness? Let's find out. The Pope to launch a global educational pact next year. This is from September 2019. So last fall, the Pope announced that he was going to have a global educational pact. And he announced that all of the political and religious leaders of the world were to come together on May 14th, 2020. That's just next month, less than a month from now. May 14th. Remember that date, May 14th, 2020, all the way back in September last year, long before the corona crisis ever came into the news and we knew anything about it. The Pope set a special date for signing a global pact on May 14th, 2020, related to implementing the Sustainable Development Goals and the common good. Here's another article about it from September 16th, 2019, that tells us Pope Francis invites political leaders to sign a global pact, union of church and state, signing an official global pact to work together to educate the world according to the principles of the Lucis Trust, what had been the Lucifer Publishing Company, the principles of theosophy, which are completely in rebellion against God and his law. But what's interesting about that is, does anybody realize that there's actually a Catholic saint whose name is Saint Corona? And Saint Corona is actually known as the patron saint of pandemics. And here is a Catholic website, CatholicPilgrimage.com, and it's confirming the rumor that, yes, it's true, there actually is a Saint Corona, and she is the patron saint of pandemics. And what's especially interesting about the patron saint, Saint Corona, the patron saint of pandemics, is it tells us right here at the end of this article, Saint Corona's feast day, along with Saint Victor's, is what day? May 14th. So the date that the Pope set for his global pact for all of the politicians of the world and the religions of the world to come together and sign a pact about implementing the Sustainable Development Goals and the education program of theosophy and the common good, which includes legislating Sunday sacredness, and to bind them in a legal pact to follow it, was set for the feast day of Saint Corona this year, which we now find out is right in the midst of a pandemic about the coronavirus. I don't find that to be a coincidence. I don't believe in coincidences. I'm not a coincidence theorist. This crisis of the corona crisis is seeming a little bit more planned and less spontaneous than it seemed to be before. Now, because of the crisis, this global pact signing has actually been delayed into the fall because of the social distancing measures. But we see it was originally planned for the feast day of St. Corona. Now let's see how the mindset of the world is being conditioned to fall into this false system, this unity in error. We see articles coming out very soon, very early in the corona crisis. This is March 13th, over a month ago at this point. And coronavirus, is God unhappy with mankind? Measures are being made to condition people to see this crisis as a punishment from God that's going to require legislating Sunday sacredness in order to appease God and to remove the judgments that he's supposedly bringing upon us, like this corona crisis. We also see just a couple weeks ago, on March 30th, 2020, we see a conference that was held on Catholic social teaching panel that says the coronavirus pandemic is a what? It's a moral test. This is a really fascinating article. It, of course, was held at Jesuit Georgetown University. And it tells us, while much is uncertain during this global health crisis, the belief that Catholic social thought requires valuing human life and dignity over economic concerns was the widespread consensus among Catholic leaders during an online forum convened at Georgetown University. The range of voices included small business owner, healthcare professionals, a policy expert, and a priest, all of whom met virtually last Thursday for an online dialogue on Catholic social thought and the coronavirus crisis, organized by the university's Initiative on Catholic Social Thought and the Public Life. This is a moral test for us, said John Carr, director of Georgetown's Initiative and moderator of the panel. The scale of suffering and death and the tensions and divisions and isolations is just overwhelming, and a test like this reveals who we are, what we believe, and what type of society we're becoming. Interesting. Carr said the traditions of our faith are being turned upside down at the moment, noting that honoring the Sabbath, which he means Sunday, means staying at home. And honoring your father and your mother means keeping your distance in order to stem the spread of the coronavirus. So now we see the social distancing measures and the policies that are being implemented in the emergency for the coronavirus are being connected directly to honoring Sunday by the Catholics themselves in seeking to set the tone that this is a moral test. Will we honor Sunday? Right there in black and white. Father Miles Sheehan, who is both a Jesuit priest and a physician, turned to Ignatius of Loyola, who said that love is shown in deeds, not words, emphasizing that social distancing is one concrete way of loving one's neighbor. So now love is being defined by the Catholics in the midst of this crisis by following social distancing. Love is not expressing the supreme love of God as expressed in the word of God. No, love is following the government rules on social distancing. He also highlighted those of the front lines who are putting their own health at risk for the sake of the community, such as healthcare workers and grocery store clerks who still show up for work to provide essential services. We need to look at our communities with respect for the individual in ways that we can balance that, and a time like this certainly stresses that, he said, of the tensions created by the COVID-19 pandemic. So again, talking about the tension between individualism and community, and how the community needs, the common good needs, are outweighing the needs of the individual. Even so, despite these sacrifices for the sake of the common good, in case you thought I was just making the connection to the common good, panelist sister Caroline Keehan, a nurse and former president and CEO of the Catholic Health Association, said that the United States is fortunate that there are echoes of Catholic social thought in the founding documents of the country. Whoa, really? That's interesting. In particular, she said that it will help to ensure that the poor and the marginalized are not left out or the least in line during this pandemic. We're going to see this being no one being left out. We saw that that was part of the Catholic social teaching of the common good and of solidarity. No one can be left out. Very important principle we're going to see that's being implemented. Reina Guardado, a Salvadorian immigrant and owner of a family restaurant in Bethesda, Maryland, provided a first-hand testimony that, speaking of the hardships she and her family have faced in recent weeks, making difficult decisions to lay off workers, but also of the support she has received from the community through a crowdfunding campaign, which has allowed them to rehire 4 workers that have families to support, so that the restaurant can in turn deliver meals for delivery and takeout. John Monahan, senior advisor for global health to the president of Georgetown University, who worked with the Health and Human Services during the H1N1 pandemic, said that while the U.S. may be a diverse and pluralistic nation, we have to use moral language in making the case for the common good, and that Catholic social thought thought is particularly useful for that. So see, we have a high-level Catholic Jesuit who tells us that he was working in the H1N1 pandemic in 2009 with the U.S. government, the Health and Human Services Department, and that he has an inside line in working with them, and he's now using moral language based on Catholic social thought to press the case for the common good. If we're constraining individual freedom and rights on behalf of doing something that is going to benefit the public good or benefit people you never know, there are 300 million people in this country and 7 billion people on Earth. If we take steps to mitigate, those steps are going to save lives that we don't know. So social distancing and the mitigation measures that have brought in a draconian police state nearly, where we are under house arrest practically, is all for the common good, and that individual freedom and rights, such as your individual conscience to worship the way you want to, have to be constrained according to this Catholic social teaching. Monahan specifically highlighted the notion of solidarity and gave the example of discussions and eventual decisions that were made during the last pandemic, where the principle came into particular focus when President Barack Obama decided that if a vaccine became available, the U.S. would share 10% with the World Health Organization for the benefit of low-income countries. So we see the principle of the common good and solidarity were already being pushed in previous administrations, and now they're being implemented in the coronavirus crisis. He said that it's very possible that the U.S. will soon once more face similar decisions regarding antivirals, diagnostics, and perhaps an eventual vaccine to fight the coronavirus, and that the principles of Catholic social teaching are useful in answering the question, how much are we willing to share? So the allocation of public resources has to be subject to the Catholic social teaching of the common good, because that's what we saw from the definition of the common good actually required that. While the participants were all positive about the use of the Church's social teaching, they warned of challenging times ahead, both at the macro and micro level. Keenan and Sheehan both warned that healthcare workers are still in need of basic supplies such as face masks, while Guardado wondered what will happen to the undocumented workers who won't receive support from the recent economic stimulus package backed by Congress. The panelists also highlighted that broad structural changes are needed, especially when it comes to the way the U.S. healthcare system operates, but also emphasized that local action is needed too, with multiple speakers suggesting that healthy Catholics email their local parishes to find out if elderly parishioners need help getting groceries or support with their basic needs. Implement it first at the local level. That's the principle of subsidiarity. They're hitting all the points here of Catholic social teaching. Common good, solidarity, subsidiarity. We can't win this thing unless we have a sense that all 7 billion of us have a threat from the virus. We're all in it together. That's authentic and integral human development and solidarity. And then it closes out and even makes a mention about the environment and how important that is. And we're staring it in the face right now. We would do worse than to follow the message of Catholic social teaching and the example of Pope Francis. Very, very interesting. So let's see what's really happening in response. So this is just some Catholics calling for these things to happen. But is the government really doing it? White House on COVID-19, we're all in this together. This is now becoming one of the mottos that's being attached to the corona crisis, and the need to follow the social distancing, the need to ruin the economy, the need to do away with the principles of the Constitution and rule by dictatorial edict, because we're all in this together. That's the common good and solidarity right there. Coming straight from the White House. Here's another website. This is a Work Human website. It's a humanism website, essentially. And what's their messaging? The COVID-19 challenge. We're all in this together. Here's another website. It's called the Zen Pagan. What's their message during the COVID-19 crisis? We're all in this together. It's almost like they're getting talking points. So the government's on board, the pagans are on board, the false Christianity's on board. We're all in this together. What's another important principle that's really being talked about here? Leave no one behind. Here, it's directly connected to the Sustainable Development Goals. This is an article from last fall, October 2019. The ambitious 15-year agenda known as the Sustainable Development Goals, adopted in 2015 by all members of the United Nations, contains a pledge that no one will be left behind. So a fundamental principle from its inception in 2015, when the Pope told them to implement it, and they unanimously implemented it, was that no one will be left behind, because no one can opt out. We saw that there was a principle of both the common good and of solidarity. And here, the Brookings Institute was talking about it back again in last fall. Well, here I did a search on No One Left Behind, and lo and behold, what do I find here? In Scotland, they have a program, No One Left Behind. In Australia, they have a program, ensure that the government is going to ensure that no one is left behind in this crisis. The Buddhists have a response to the COVID-19 pandemic. It's that no one can be left behind. There's also a principle, leave no one behind in Rome. Israel, no one left behind. And you could go on and on and on. All the governments of the world are all coming together on the principles of we're all in it together and no one left behind, both of which are based on Catholic social teaching. These principles are being implemented because the common good has gone global, as the Pope told us last May. We also see part of the leave no one behind strategy globally, as part of the World Health Organization and the Sustainable Development Goals, is that everybody has to be vaccinated with these poisons that they're putting together. And I'm going to have I'm probably not going to do it in a sermon. I'm just going to do a whole separate talk and put it up on my YouTube channel on what's happening medically and the false information and the misinformation and how vaccines plays into that. But we see the vaccination program is part of this leave no one behind. Don't forget that. What other messaging is going forth? Pope says the coronavirus outbreak may be one of the nature's responses to climate change. So now the Pope is connecting the coronavirus outbreak is actually a consequence of us not taking care of the climate, which of course requires legislating Sunday sacredness, as we saw from his encyclical. We see here in an article from March 21st, 2020, the Chicago Catholic Church bells to ring 5 times a day as a call to prayer during the coronavirus outbreak. Isn't that something that Muslims actually do? 5 calls to prayer, five a day? But because the human fraternity, that they signed a document with the Muslim imam, now the Catholic Church is ringing the bells to a call to prayer 5 times a day, reminding us and bringing us back to the Dark Ages when the Catholic Church bells signaled what the people were supposed to do. Here we see an article, very interesting. Priests reveal how the coronavirus crisis has unleashed intense demonic activity. And no doubt, intense demonic activity has swept the world with this satanic panic and the mass hysteria that has accompanied the coronavirus crisis. Here's also an interesting article. Chris Cuomo, who is a host on CNN, he described, he was coronavirus, COVID-19 positive, and he described his experience of suffering under the virus, and he tells us he had wicked, phantasmagorical experiences that are not dreams. So one of the symptoms of COVID-19, as testified by a CNN host, is essentially demonic experiences and demonic visions, hallucinations. As part of the coronavirus crisis, Pope Francis pushes for universal basic income. He wants everybody to become dependent on this world government system that is implementing the common good in order to legislate Sunday sacredness. So the economic system, just like we saw the common good, all the economic resources have to be given to the people so that they can achieve their own perfection. Here we see from a Catholic website, Crux Now, the SBA, that's the Small Business Administration of the United States government, allows church entities to obtain needed loans to keep workers on staff. So now, as part of the coronavirus crisis, the government is financing churches' payrolls to pay their workers. Very interesting union of church and state. Greta Thunberg, who we've seen in previous studies is being manipulated to promote this climate crisis, which behind, of course, is implementing legislating Sunday sacredness. We see here, she tells us we need to unite behind the science and join a digital strike for the best interests of our common society, the common good. So for the common good, we need to unite behind the science. And this is a similar message that's going out during the coronavirus crisis, that we need to surrender all of our individual rights, our civil rights, because the scientists tell us we need to do it. Here's another search I did on Greta, and we see she's also giving the messaging and the pandemic simultaneously. That they go against the climate crisis and the fight against the pandemic are one and the same fight. And we've already seen the messaging, how the climate crisis is about legislating Sunday sacredness. And we need to also, she's been saying for quite some time now, we need to unite behind the experts and we have to listen to the science. It's a message that she actually sent or tweeted to President Trump back in the fall, that the scientists know best and we have to follow and listen to them. In fact, what we're finding out now is that the scientists today are really the priests and prophets of today, the prophets of Baal and Asherah. And this idea is not just one that I thought of. It's actually here. I just did a search on this, and look how many articles quickly come up. Are scientists becoming the new priests? Climate scientists are not priests or prophets. That's one against the idea. And then the study of man, prophets, priests, and social scientists. And it goes on and on and on. Scientists as prophets. Are we to listen to the scientists as our priests and our prophets to tell us how to live morally in this moral test of the corona crisis? Because that's what they're telling us to do. Here's an interesting program that I listened to. I heard on NPR a week or so ago. It was on April 9th, 2020. They had an expert on ethics and morality, Michael Schur, and it was about ethics and morality in the crisis. And it was a whole hour program. I listened to the whole thing, and every single expert on the program here on NPR, and every single caller who called in, they all defined morality and what was the right thing to do as obeying whatever the government tells you to do. No matter how draconian the rules are, no matter what they've already told you to do, or anything that they might come up to later, according to what the scientists say, if you disobey them, then you're an immoral person. So morality is not being defined by the law of God. Morality is being defined on what the government tells you to do and what the scientists tell you to do. And this entire mindset is being pushed out to the public. And this was coming from NPR, which is an incredibly secular organization. And yet they were all on board that the right moral thing to do was to obey the government and the scientists. Of course, inspiration tells us here from last day events, it tells us, when Protestantism shall stretch your hand across the gulf to grasp the hand of the Roman power, clasp the hand with spiritualism, when under the influence of this threefold union our country shall repudiate every principle of its constitution as a Protestant and Republican government, and shall make provision for the propagation of papal falsehoods and delusions, then we may know that the time has come for the marvelous working of Satan, and that the end is near. Quoting Testimonies for the Church, Volume 5, page 451 from 1885. And we see, in the midst of this crisis, our government reaction has been to repudiate every principle of our Constitution as a Protestant and Republican government. We've been told that the only way to deal with the coronavirus outbreak is to suspend our Constitution and implement a loosely facade of martial law where the president and the governors and the mayors rule by edict and no longer bother with needing to pass laws or follow laws or constitutions. And so we have reached the time when the marvelous working of Satan is happening, because papal falsehoods and delusions are being propagated. We've seen the principles of Catholic social teaching are being implemented by all the governments of the world. And this is not necessary, brothers and sisters. There is no reason to suspend the Constitution to deal with the coronavirus crisis. The very idea that's been proposed, that the founders could never have envisioned the need and the need to suspend civil liberties as a result of a contagious pandemic, is absurd. Contagious pandemics or epidemics were very frequent and well known by the founders. And they knew the history also of a global pandemic of the plagues that came in the Middle Ages. And they implemented a system of government that made no provision to suspend our civil liberties in order to deal with such a crisis. In fact, they created our civil liberties precisely to protect us from efforts to do precisely that. And it's been turned on its head in this crisis because people don't know our history and our founding documents. What else is happening in current events right now? March 15th, 2020, Trump declares a national day of prayer for Americans affected by coronavirus and the national response efforts. President Trump on Saturday declared Sunday, March 15th, a national day of prayer for all Americans affected by the coronavirus pandemic and for our national response efforts. So calling for people to pray because that people are sick and suffering and even dying, there's nothing wrong with that. I don't even think there's anything wrong with the president urging people to pray, but calling a national day of prayer and officially declaring it by an edict, a declaration of the government, is crossing a line. And he declared what day? Sunday, to be a national day of prayer, honoring Sunday. And I've seen other articles and talks about this, and he actually did it in response to evangelical leaders telling him that he had to do it. And they said they told him to do it, and he said, yes, I will do it. That is the false prophet dictating to the image of the beast what to do, and the beast obeys. Here is from March 25th, 2020. Trump Pence joins 700 pastors in a prayer call during the coronavirus crisis outbreak. So all the evangelical leaders are now doing prayer calls with Trump and Pence, and also giving him advice and guidance on what to do amidst the crisis. The religious power telling the civil power what to do, and them agreeing. And how does he respond? Trump taps emergency powers as virus relief plans proceed. Suspending the Constitution. These emergency powers all involve suspending current laws and constitutional powers and civil rights, repudiating every principle of our Constitution. And they've done it. This is at the national level, but it's also happening at the local level. For instance, here in Massachusetts, the Baker-Polito administration announces COVID-19 response command center advisory board of medical experts and infectious disease specialists. Why is the coordinating committee of the local government here in Massachusetts called a command center? Because that's what they're issuing, commands. They're not issuing recommendations. They're not giving us the best information by which the political powers can make decisions in harmony with the laws of Massachusetts. No, they're issuing commands and orders and edicts and rules that have no legal basis whatsoever, and even frequently are violating the very constitutional principles both of the United States itself and the Commonwealth of Massachusetts. And I'm encountering this everywhere I go. People telling me, rules that are in place as a result of the crisis, and they're telling me, well, it's the law now. And I have to remind people, no, it's actually not the law. Laws have to actually be passed according to a constitutional process by a legislative body and signed into law. And they have to be written in advance, and they have to be followed clearly and subject to judicial oversight. None of that's happening with any of these things because they've implemented command centers at the local level, the principle of subsidiarity. States consider whether religious services qualify as essential, is an article here from NPR. And also, here, Maryland outlines what state deems as acceptable religious services amid coronavirus shutdown. So now governments are establishing rules, not by law, but by edict, suspending the Constitution and deciding what is religiously acceptable to be doing right now. This is totally unacceptable, brothers and sisters, and we should be vigorously protesting against it, corporately as a church, and yet not one peep is coming out about it from our church leaders, and especially from the so-called Religious Liberty Department and Public Affairs Department at the General Conference. They should be the ones taking the stand, but instead they were the ones who went to the Vatican last year and signed on to the idea that the Sustainable Development Goals had to be implemented and that the religions had to tell the governments how to do it. There were representatives from the Religious Liberty and Public Affairs Department at that meeting that agreed to it and that are fully on board for the Sustainable Development Goals. But they have not one peep of protest when the government is establishing edicts about how and when you can meet together to worship, or whether or not worship itself is a essential service. It's really unbelievable. We see here the DOJ, the Department of Justice for the United States government, seeks new emergency powers amid the coronavirus pandemic. What are some of these really new powers that they want? One of the requests to Congress would allow the department to petition a judge to indefinitely detain somebody during an emergency. That means indefinitely detaining without a hearing, without any due process. That's suspending the Constitution. That's the Fifth Amendment to the United States Constitution. It's the Department of Justice wants to do away with it. Is there a future crisis that's about to come upon us when they start really openly implementing the Sunday laws rather than doing it under the cover of darkness, as they're doing now and as inspiration told us they would do? When they're going to start indefinitely detaining believers who take a stand against legislating Sunday sacredness? Well, they're already preparing the way to create the policies that allow them to do it. Here, Edward Snowden, the whistleblower, tells us, warns the government surveillance amid COVID-19 could be long-lasting. Governments could look for reasons to continue tracking people's activity, he says. And he talks about how things like the Patriot Act and 9/11 were implemented to meet that crisis, but then they remained in place and they never go away. Just like all the many of the policies that are being implemented right now, they're never going away. These are the new reality for us, where the government rules by edict. Here's another article from the AP, Dismantling Democracy. Virus used as an excuse to quell dissent. Here's another article from the Stanford Advocate. Leaders seize new powers to fight the coronavirus. Fears grow for democracy. These are secular sources, and they're concerned about it. Why is our government not concerned about it? Why is our church not concerned about it? Here's from Reason magazine. The surveillance state thrives during the pandemic. Can we take government officials at their word that they'll eventually abandon their new powers? Here's from Foreign Policy magazine. Coronavirus has started a censorship pandemic. Governments around the world are banning fake news about the crisis and cracking down on their critics while they're at it. So anybody who has any opinions that go against the government or go against any of the things that they're doing to deal with this emergency, it's being labeled as fake news and being shut down, not just here in America, but globally by all of the governments of the world. All the kings of the earth committed fornication with the beast. All the world wondering after the beast. Here's from Yahoo. Coronavirus lockdowns and civil liberties come to a remote corner of California. It's reaching everywhere, shutting down civil liberties, repudiating every principle of our Constitution and Republican government. Jared Kushner, the president's son-in-law, team seeks national coronavirus surveillance system, an entire surveillance system implementing the Patriot Act for healthcare and undermining civil liberties. Tech companies step up fight against bad coronavirus info. So the tech companies are censoring searches, they're removing content, and what are the kind of bad coronavirus information they're removing? Things like natural remedies, vitamin C, zinc, hydrotherapy, sunshine, fresh air. And I don't, for time's sake, I'm not going to go into it. I can give you specific examples where things like promoting people get fresh air and sunshine are being removed by the tech companies. You can't give other opinions. That's why you're not hearing other opinions, is because they're censoring anybody who says anything against the common good line that they've all come together to agree on. Well, here is some protest being made, a fiasco in the making. As the coronavirus pandemic takes hold, we are making decisions without reliable data. This is an amazing article from Stat News, where it goes through how all of the data that they're giving to base as the reason why they have to implement such draconian policies and suspend the Constitution, that none of them are reliable. And it completely undermines the entire basis for the crisis policies. Here's from LifeSite. Numbers don't line up. Case for panicking over coronavirus is falling apart. If you see the news all the time and it's making you scared and it's making you confirming your idea that, well, maybe it makes sense what they're doing, that's because the opinions that are actually showing up, poking the holes in those arguments are being censored. And you're not hearing them. These are very obscure publications that are putting these things out. And who knows how much longer they'll even be on the web, on the news, available on the web before they're also censored. Here is from National Review. Authoritarian overreach is unnecessary to fight the pandemic. I agree 100%. Our church ought to agree 100%. Why is this not the official position of the church? I don't know. Here it tells us from the AP, far-right U.S. politicians label lockdowns as anti-constitutional. So if you point out that the policies that they're doing are completely unconstitutional, you're labeled as being far-right to dismiss you, and that you are wrong to label them as anti-constitutional, even though they're clearly anti-constitutional. They're undeniably anti-constitutional. But you're going to be marginalized and made to be a quack or a conspiracy theorist if you promote such things. Michigan residents sue Governor Whitmer over the coronavirus pandemic orders. So some citizens are actually standing up and suing, even though the most of the courts are closed, and who knows if these things are even going to get heard by the courts anytime soon. And the economic measures, we saw that part of the common good was taking all of the property and the economic resources and subjecting them to the church-state union to implement the common good. And that's what they're doing here with this economic crisis that they've created. Fed will make up to $4 trillion in loans to businesses to rescue the U.S. economy, Mnuchin says. This is from March 28, 2020. The Federal Reserve is a private bank. It's not a government agency at all. And they loan the money to the government at interest. So they just made a $4 trillion loan, which they're going to start making money off of in order to rescue the businesses that are collapsing because of the policies that they implement. Here's another article from Yahoo Finance, very mainstream source. Fed is seizing control of the entire U.S. bond market. An amazing article here as well. It says not only are they taking over the U.S. Treasury market, but they're taking over commercial loans, they're taking over mortgages, they're taking over loans to small businesses. The Fed is seizing control of the entire bond market, tens of trillions of dollars, all of which they make money off of at interest from money that they created out of nothing. Here's April 9th, 2020, a new $2.3 trillion Fed plan to aid localities and companies. This is in addition to the $2.2 trillion that was passed by Congress. This is another $2.3 trillion on top of that. For this one aimed at local companies and locality. This is trying to make every single person, every single government, local, state, every single business completely dependent on this overarching system that is being implemented to bring about the common good. And so that you can't go against the system because you're financially dependent on it to survive. We see here that while going cashless has added a value to the pandemic age, they're seeking now, which is a long time plan they've been trying to bring about, to get rid of cash so that they can turn off your account with a switch or a click of a mouse and you can't buy or sell anymore. Well, there's been a big pushback against getting rid of cash up until now, but with the coronavirus crisis, now people are ready to go along with it because they don't want to touch cash because they think it's going to transmit the virus to them. So get ready for cash to go away because they need to get ready to cause us so we cannot buy or sell. The time has come, brothers and sisters. The time to prophesy again. Recovery law allows Fed to rope off public as it spends billions. This is an interesting article from Politico that says all this money that they're spending, they're creating loopholes where there's no accountability or transparency to even know where they're sending billions and even trillions of dollars, and no accountability about where it's going and whether it'll ever be paid back. And this is from Yahoo. So much is unknown about the pandemic because the government keeps a lid on it. Again, the government is holding back the true information that doesn't fit with their official narrative that they keep putting before the people. And what are the consequences of these policies that they're putting in place? 500 million more people face poverty due to the virus, according to this report. 500 million people by April 9th, 3 weeks into the crisis, 500 million people have fallen into poverty that weren't in poverty. And the statistics are very clear that people who are in poverty, they're sicker and they die earlier and they live much more difficult, hard lives. Many more people are going to end up dying as a consequence of these policies than ever would die from the coronavirus itself. Not to dismiss it as a fraud or a hoax. There is a serious bug that's going around that's causing people to get sick and die, but it's not what they're making it out to be. And they're not giving the context to help us understand the consequences of the decisions they're making supposedly to help us, which are actually causing more harm than good. We must count the deaths from shutdowns as well as from the coronavirus, according to the New York Post, because they're going to end up being a lot more from the shutdown than from the coronavirus. Won't spend time on that. Then we have several articles here about some of the evangelical pastors that are actually standing up against these orders, saying that we can't have church services and defying the stay-at-home orders to meet, including this pastor, Rodney Howard Brown. I think he's in the Tampa area in Florida, and actually got the government to acknowledge that the church had a right to meet for religious services, and the government didn't have a right to tell them not to do it because he stood up and claimed his rights, his civil rights, unlike our church that refuses to do it. Here's a Louisiana church that's also doing the same things, and the pastor has been charged and arrested. And he continues to meet, including for Easter here in this article from The Sun. And this is the Florida pastor, Rodney Howard Brown, who flouts the stay-at-home order for Easter, but who also got the Florida that he had a right to do it. Because the government shouldn't be able to tell the church how and when to worship. Here's from the Christian Post, citing First Amendment, outspoken minority of pastors refuses to close churches amid pandemic. Why is the Seventh-day Adventist Church not among them? Is what I want to know. It's very mysterious. Here's from Mediate. Kentucky governor explains why cops will track down Easter worshipers using license plates. What we're asking is love your neighbor. So the people that are actually exercising their civil right to actually come together and worship amidst the pandemic, the government is actually going in there, they're using license plate readers to track every single one, and they're actually sending people to their homes to quarantine them against their will. House arrest for worshiping God, according to the dictates of your own conscience. Then we have a whole line of articles here about social distancing is going to get darker. Ooh, what's that all about? Let's see some of the things that they're doing. A judge forces McHenry County, Illinois Health Department to provide all the names of COVID-19 patients to police. So now, because of these edicts, these government edicts that have no basis in law and are unconstitutional, they're actually providing the names of patients to police. That violates several laws, including HIPAA laws, where you can't disclose someone's medical conditions to the government. But here, the police now will have a list of anybody who is supposedly COVID-19 positive. Can you imagine a future time, very soon, when other names are going to be given to police who aren't going along with the system? Here's an interesting article. Would you give up your health or location data to return to work? They're already creating a system where you're going to have to submit to their rules, which we've seen they've defined as what is moral and right. And if you don't submit to it, you're not even going to be allowed to go back to work ever again. They're very much leading to that's going to be the result. Unless you surrender your rights, you're not going to have the right to work anymore. Coronavirus victims may be given passports so that people know that they've had COVID-19. Papers, please. Give me your papers, please. We want to see if you can come to the grocery store to buy groceries. Do you have your papers? Your passport from the government. That's where we're going to, brothers and sisters. Very, very soon. They're already talking about it and making plans for it. And here's the social distancing going darker. Police thy neighbor. Virus fears fuel quarantine shaming. Neighbors are spying on neighbors and reporting them. Is the time coming very soon when neighbors are going to spy on you for keeping Sabbath instead of supposedly not keeping social distancing rules? Which, by the way, this whole article is really interesting. Anybody who's seen walking together, the neighbors are calling the police on them when families are allowed to walk together. But the neighbors have no idea. They're just the people are reporting each other. There's a snooping, snitch mindset where everybody's turning against everybody else. And that's what they want. The fear is being absolutely manipulated. Facebook to warn users who liked coronavirus hoaxes. By the way, the list of coronavirus hoaxes here includes things like following natural remedies to boost your immune system. That's what Facebook defines as a hoax. And if you like it, they're keeping lists. Here's an article. Journalists are being threatened and detained as countries on multiple continents restrict coronavirus coverage. The reason why you're only hearing one side of the story, where you're getting a universal, a coordinated message that only harmonizes with what the government wants you to hear, is because journalists are actually being threatened and detained if they say anything that goes against the official line and these speak out against these dictatorial policies. Here's an article of a man who was actually dragged off a Philadelphia bus by 10 police officers at the same time for not wearing a face mask. Even though in Philadelphia at the time, there was no even order that you had to wear a face mask. The bus driver just wanted him to wear a face mask, even though there was no rule that he had to. Even though the rule wouldn't even have been a law, it would have been just an edict. But there was no such edict. The bus driver just wanted him to wear a face mask. And because he didn't, the bus driver called the police on him, and the police came, 10 of them, and dragged him off the bus, even though he was doing nothing wrong or illegal. Coronavirus patients charged with attempted murder for failing to self-isolate. Is it not going to be very far off, brothers and sisters, when if you go against the mindset that Sunday has to be made sacred to prevent all of these calamities that are coming upon us, that they're going to look at like you are an infection, that you're a virus who's infecting the mindset of people by telling them that Saturday is God's seventh-day Sabbath. And they're going to charge you with attempted murder and drag you off of buses. It's coming, brothers and sisters. All right, as we wrap up here, this is really interesting. Chinese biological experiments to infect humans with coronavirus exposed in 2015 by Italian state media. The Chinese were specifically conducting biological experiments on how to infect humans with the coronavirus in the lab in Wuhan, China, all the way back at least as far as 2015. Is this a planned crisis, brothers and sisters? But is it just China? Is China the one who's against us? Here's an article, bombshell. Taxpayer-funded NIH, that's the U.S. National Institute of Health, funneled $3.7 million to the Wuhan virus research lab, believed to have engineered the coronavirus bioweapon. So the U.S. government was actually funding the Chinese on how to infect humans with the coronavirus, because all the kings of the earth are working together to bring about the policies of the beast power. Here's a fascinating article. Event 201. Have you heard of Event 201, brothers and sisters? Bill Gates and the World Economic Forum simulated a coronavirus outbreak 6 weeks before the first case in Wuhan. In October 2019, specifically October 18th, 2019, in New York, New York, the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation, together with the Johns Hopkins Center for Health Security, in partnership with the World Economic Forum, all came together and had a tabletop exercise on a pandemic, a theoretical pandemic, and one of the scenarios that they talked about was a coronavirus pandemic, and all the policies that they said would have to be implemented to control that, including all these emergency orders and shutting down the government and business and wrecking the economy, and everything that's happened since. It all was talked about in advance before the outbreak even happened, just a few weeks before it happened. Coincidence? I'm not a coincidence theorist. Just in case you don't like that source that I just used, here's from the Center for Health Security at Johns Hopkins, Event 201. They themselves confirm at the Johns Hopkins Center for Health Security, in partnership with the World Economic Forum and the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation, hosted Event 201, a high-level pandemic exercise on October 18th, 2019. Where? New York, New York. Where's the center of the outbreak now? New York, New York. And the exercise illustrated areas where public-private partnerships will be necessary during the response to a severe pandemic in order to diminish the large-scale economic and societal consequences. This is a planned crisis to implement the common good through solidarity and subsidiarity and integral human development, all with the goal of legislating Sunday sacredness. This is by design. Intelligence report warned of corona crisis as early as November. So before the first case ever was exposed in Wuhan, China, the U.S. intelligence already knew it was coming and had written intelligence report. They knew it was coming before it happened. How did they know? Maybe because we were funding the lab? Maybe, possibly. And as a consequence, the U.S. military is preparing for a worst-case contagion scenario, which we've not even got to. We're not in the worst case. This is for even worse things that they're planning on coming. And the military is ready to take over completely, true martial law, but it's a secret. They won't tell you what the plans are. But they've got the plans. The plans are in place. Everything is happening according to the plan. We saw that from the Lucis Trust. It's all following the plan from Lucifer. And the plan is it's not going away. They're already putting out the mindset that this is going to continue and not go away anytime soon, if ever. By December, we're going to go through this again here from Politico. Even if they relax the social distancing rules and reopen the economy over the summer, when everybody starts getting outside and gets vitamin D and the virus goes away, they're planning to tell us it's coming back, including all of the draconian measures that are coming back before the end of the year. Here's from MSN, Kashkari. This is a high-level Federal Reserve Bank Minneapolis president, Neil Kashkari. He says the U.S. may face 18 months of rolling shutdown. Get ready for this to be the new normal. And the New York Post goes on to say coronavirus social distancing may be needed until when? 2022, according to Harvard researchers. I'm spitting distance away from the Harvard campus as I share this with you right now. What date do they say it's going to have to go to? 2022. What date did we say that the end of the end time, 7 times that's repeating, would happen to? It would take us to August 2022. Interesting that that's now the message that's going forth, that these restrictive measures, which they're using to implement the common good and Sunday sacredness, they're going to have to continue to 2022 just by happenstance. It's just a coincidence. And then finally, we see here from the Street Journal a opinion piece from, of all people, Henry Kissinger. The coronavirus pandemic will forever alter the world order. The U.S. must protect its citizens from disease while starting the urgent work of planning for a new epoch. It's never changing. We're never going back to the old America. It's by design, this is it. This is the final crisis happening before our eyes. And the insider elite have planned it, and the response to the crisis, whether it's a natural outbreak or a planned outbreak, the response to it has been planned. And it has been to, and we know from the Bible, from Job, that Satan can cause outbreaks. He did on Job. So even if humans weren't involved in causing the outbreak, Satan could have been involved in causing the outbreak to be in harmony with his timing to bring about his final crisis, because God has given permission to do it, as God gave Satan permission to do it to Job. And they've had the plan ready to implement the policies of Catholic social teaching all along, and they don't intend to let them go. So I pray that we realize that this really is exactly what we said would happen. That the very things that should be happening, the points that we pointed to as the antitypical 508 and the antitypical 538, and also the beginning of the 7 times with the Pope's visit, that pointed to the common good, to solidarity, to subsidiarity, and authentic and integral human development, are now being implemented as policy by all the national governments of the world, by the local state governments, and by the local city governments. And it's reality today. I pray that all God's people are awake and realize that these things really are so. Here, let's pray. Gracious Heavenly Father, our most holy Creator God, we humble ourselves in the dust, O Lord. These things are too big for us. We can't deal with them, O Lord. We need you to take total control of each one of our lives and each one of our hearts, to grant us your peace that passes all understanding, and to strengthen us to be your witnesses, O Lord, to stand up against this satanic plan to usher in a last crisis, to sweep away the world and take them away from you, O Lord. Help us to reveal your love, to allow you to work through us, to give a message of hope, to be encouraged that you are in control, that this crisis is a response to your third angel's message going with power, to your pouring out your latter rain, which is available for us right now. Help us to recognize it. Help us to choose you in your righteousness, in your faith, in your love, in your life. Make it our reality as our prayer. May it be in Jesus' name. Amen.